She laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a nervous deflection, but an actual laugh, sharp, dismissive, the kind that echoes in a glass-walled office and lingers in your memory long after the sound fades. I had just asked for a 12% raise, sitting across from her with a folder containing 18 months of documented results, performance metrics that anyone with basic literacy could verify. The AI system I'd built had automated processes that used to require 3 full-time employees. It had cut operational costs by 40% in the first quarter alone. The numbers weren't debatable, but she wasn't looking at numbers. She was looking at me the way you look at someone who's fundamentally misunderstood their position in the hierarchy. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled in that rehearsed executive pose, and began talking about market rates, budget constraints, and the importance of being a team player. Her tone carried the smooth condescension of someone who'd delivered this speech before, who knew exactly how much power sat on her side of the desk. I nodded at the appropriate moments, thanked her for her time, and walked out with my security badge still clipped to my belt. But something colder than disappointment had already settled in my chest. This wasn't about the percentage. It was about being seen as replaceable by someone whose operation would collapse without what I'd built. In the week that followed, I did what I always do when emotions run too hot. I pulled up spreadsheets and started calculating, not out of anger but out of curiosity, about what 12% actually represented in the context of what I'd delivered. The AI system wasn't a minor efficiency upgrade. It was the backbone of 3 critical workflows that touched every department in the organization. Before I built it, teams were drowning in manual data entry, compliance reporting, and inventory reconciliation. After implementation, those same teams were redeployed to revenue-generating projects. The cost savings in the first year alone exceeded 7 figures. My salary, even with the requested increase, wouldn't have cracked 6. The math was almost insulting. But as I reviewed email threads and project timelines, something else became clear. My termination, because that's what a rejected raise really signals, had been timed with precision I hadn't noticed in the moment. We were 8 months into a product launch that depended entirely on the infrastructure I'd designed. Leadership had waited until the system was stable, documented, and theoretically maintainable by someone cheaper before making their position clear. I started reviewing my employment contract with attention I should have given it 2 years earlier. The intellectual property clauses were standard, but standard doesn't mean airtight. The AI core had been developed partially during off hours using frameworks and methodologies I'd brought from previous work. The line between company property and personal expertise wasn't as clear as they'd assumed. The choice presented itself with a clarity that felt almost physical. I could stay, accept the message that my contributions were worth exactly what they decided to pay, and continue building systems for people who saw me as overhead rather than investment. Or I could leave, take everything I'd learned, and offer it to someone who might value the work differently. The fear arrived immediately. Legal threats, non-compete enforcement, reputation damage in an industry where everyone knows everyone. I imagined the emails, the carefully worded accusations, the quiet ways organizations destroy credibility when you stop being useful. At night, doubt whispered that maybe I was overreacting, that 12% wasn't worth burning bridges, that professionalism meant swallowing pride and moving forward. But every morning, when I logged into systems I'd built from scratch and watched them run flawlessly without acknowledgement, the doubt dissolved. I started researching competitors, not out of spite, but with the same methodical approach I'd use for any strategic decision. The industry wasn't large and the problems were universal. One name kept surfacing, a mid-sized firm that had been trying to scale for 3 years but kept hitting operational bottlenecks. That sounded achingly familiar. They'd hired consultants, invested in off-the-shelf solutions, and publicly committed to transformation initiatives that kept stalling. I realized I wasn't looking at revenge. I was looking at opportunity. If the company that employed me couldn't see the value in keeping the person who'd solved their foundational problems, someone else would. And if that someone happened to be their direct competitor, that wasn't vindictiveness. That was market forces doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Sent a single email, not a desperate pitch or a lengthy explanation, just 3 carefully constructed paragraphs to the competitor's VP of operations. I mentioned understanding the operational challenges they'd referenced in a recent industry panel, offered a perspective on why traditional solutions weren't working for their specific context, and suggested a conversation if they found the approach interesting. The response came within 4 hours. We scheduled a call that turned into 3 calls that turned into an in-person meeting where I walked their leadership team through a whiteboard session on architectural principles they'd been missing. I wasn't selling them my old company's code that would have been theft and stupidity in equal measure. I was offering them the thinking, the methodology, the pattern recognition that comes from solving these problems once already. They'd been trying to build what I'd already built, spending resources on trial and error that I'd already navigated. Within 2 weeks we had terms, equity stake, creative control, title that reflected actual contribution, and a compensation structure that treated expertise like the competitive advantage it actually is. Everything the previous CEO had dismissed as unreasonable suddenly became standard operating procedure when negotiating with someone who understood value. The new system went live 4 months after I joined. Not a copy of the old architecture, but an evolution, everything I'd learned from the first implementation plus improvements. I'd been documenting mentally for a year. Within 60 days, their operational costs dropped by 38%. Processing time for their core workflows decreased by half. Customer satisfaction scores jumped because suddenly they could deliver on promises their infrastructure had previously made impossible. Industry analysts noticed. Trade publications started running features on their unexpected technological leap and strategic repositioning. Nobody knew the specifics, but everyone could see the results. My former company noticed too. Their market share started eroding in segments where they'd been dominant. Customer acquisition costs increased because suddenly there was a credible alternative with better execution speed. I watched from my new position as their quarterly earnings calls shifted in tone from confident to defensive. The CEO, my former CEO, began using words like temporary headwinds and market volatility, explanations that sounded increasingly hollow as the pattern persisted. They tried to reverse engineer what had changed, hired consultants, brought in new technical leadership, threw budget at problems that weren't really about budget. But you can't replicate architecture when you never understood the foundation. They had the code I'd left behind, but code without context is just text on a screen. The threatening emails arrived. Eventually, vague implications about intellectual property and non-compete violations, but collapsed the moment actual lawyers reviewed what I'd actually done, which was take my brain to a place that wanted it. 6 months later, the competitor had overtaken my former employer in 2 major market segments. My equity stake had tripled in paper value. The CEO, who'd laughed at 12%, resigned under board pressure. replaced by someone who immediately announced new retention policies and compensation reviews, changes that would have prevented this exact situation if implemented 2 years earlier. I won't pretend there weren't costs. Professional relationships became complicated. Some former colleagues stopped responding to messages, either out of loyalty to the old company or fear of association. Industry gossip painted me as everything, from a hero to a traitor depending on who was telling the story. There were weeks when the stress felt crushing, when I questioned whether proving a point was worth the isolation. But there were also unexpected gains. Opportunities emerged from people who'd watched the situation unfold and respected the principle behind it. Partnerships formed with leaders who understood that talent retention isn't about ping-pong, tables and mission statements. It's about recognizing contribution before someone else does. My career didn't end in that glass office when she laughed. It just stopped belonging to people who saw it as negotiable. This story isn't really about artificial intelligence or corporate competition. It's about the moment you realize your value exists, independently of anyone's willingness to acknowledge it. Most of us will face some version of this, maybe not a billion-dollar market shift, but a moment when contribution gets dismissed, when loyalty gets exploited, when staying feels safer than the alternative. The system depends on that calculation. It depends on you weighing risk against reward and choosing the devil you know. But your skills, your thinking, your capacity to solve problems, those have market value that doesn't disappear because one person refuses to see it. The courage to walk away from disrespect doesn't guarantee an easy path. It guarantees you won't spend years building wealth for people who see you as a line item. You don't need permission to be valued. You need clarity to recognize when you're not, and conviction to find people who will. One person, one decision, one refusal to accept less than their worth. That's not entitlement or ego. That's self-respect. And in an economy built on undervaluing the people who actually do the work, that might be the most disruptive force available. The question isn't whether you're replaceable, it's whether they are.